All right, good day, everybody. Welcome to another Faith-Seeking Understanding. I am Allan, your host. I am a pastor, retired professor, Bible moth, theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith-Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning that came out of my brain because my brain is always doing brainy things and crazy things. But this is still a place where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things free of charge. Another episode of Calmly Considered with Michael Cruz, the one and only Michael Cruz, who is the Grand Poobah Chair of Public Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University. Michael, how are you today?
I'm doing well, and I have to tell you that I just recently gave some money to an organization that does policy advocacy for things, and I've started getting emails and snail mail from them that is addressed to Professor Michael Cruz. So they have evidently recognized me as a part of the university, and I'm now professor. So
I mean, why not? I mean, use it in your letterhead. You use it.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. We put a little logo, a little water buffalo up there. Yeah. Or something like that. I think that's great. You are, well, you have professor status here. So
that's right.
Which is why we consult you on these deep issues.
That's right.
And sometimes they're deep. Anyway,
yes, they are.
So real quick, I just need to say the Texas Rangers are the new World Series champs.
Yeah, that was fun.
Handled the Diamondbacks pretty easily, I think.
Yeah, they did. They pretty much those last couple of games, they did it.
Yeah, so now they are, and this is their first World Series, so that's good. Always good to have teams who've never been in it before to get the title. So that's always good.
Spread the love around.
Yeah, spread the love around. And by the way, in 102 days, pitchers and catchers report. So
amen.
Who's counting? Yeah. So anyway, yeah, and football, I don't know. I don't know. Your Chiefs got handled by the Broncos the other night. Surprising to me.
It's about the worst Chiefs performance I've seen in the Mahomes years. I can't remember any that were certainly not much worse, but that was about the worst. It was pretty bad. So hopefully, usually when they do bad, they figure it out, and that gets them motivated to do better. So we'll see what happens Sunday morning while they're playing in Germany. So
well, and the Browns, I mean, their defense is playing lights out. But our offense, our quarterback, he who shall not be named, as he is called in our house, he's got this rotator cuff stuff going on, and that's kind of tricky stuff. And the one thing about Kevin Stefanski, the Browns head coach, is he's just too clever by half all the time. He just drives me crazy because they sort of made this a state secret. Yeah, well, he's hurt, and then he was cleared to play. He was cleared to play, then he didn't play. Well, Kevin, you need to go to the news media and say this is a rotator cuff injury, and here's the issue: that just because you're cleared to play doesn't mean that your arm is going to work right, because they're sensitive. And there's issues of arm strength and things like that. And for some reason, he's always. Some reporters in Cleveland have complained that his press conferences are just a waste of time, and he's just too clever by half. So then you got the rumor mill going. Well, maybe he who shall not be named doesn't want to play, and maybe there's something else. What else is going on here? And it's like, just come out and say here's what's going on, and it's week to week. And so we'll let you know. I mean, but the way it works. But Stefanski is interesting. He thinks too hard. So anyway, speaking of thinking too hard, Michael.
Yes.
we're in a subject today for which I just am skeptical that there is any solution. We're going to talk about the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And of course, as we have for the last 3.5 weeks, or it's coming up on 4 weeks, I think, Israel and we say Palestinians, but I'm going to say Hamas, because I want to distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinians, are going at it. There was this terrible Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, slaughtering concert goers who were there in wherever, a place not too far from the Gaza Strip border. taking hostages, which are still a lot of them that have been taken and are still there in Gaza somewhere. And a lot of loss of life on both sides, and innocence on both sides. This has been going on for a long time, and I think that it's become so complicated because there's so many things at work here.
Right.
I just despair that anytime soon there's going to be some kind of peace solution. And so I think today you and I will probably we'll be long on the problem, but probably not offer a lot of profound, deep answers.
I think you're right. Yes, absolutely. I can think of few geopolitical issues that are as complex and as difficult to unravel as that situation. It's going to require something really remarkable.
Yeah, and it's going to require players on both sides who are really willing to come to the table. I mean, this is one of the things that right now, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and there's no other way to say it. They are a terrorist organization. They're not interested in the Palestinian people except as political leverage against Israel.
Right.
And as long as they're running the show over there in Gaza, I just don't see anything constructive happening there. On the other side, I don't think Netanyahu is he's the take that I have read, and so I'm telling you what I have read. So it's not like I'm over there in the throes of the government. But that, not Netanyahu has been charged in corruption for years, that there's all kinds of, he's in the courts, there's all kinds of things going on. And that basically Netanyahu has been more concerned about, of course, preserving himself, which means he caters to the most extremes on his side, the Zionists will call them, who believe that Israel is entitled to all that land, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And he has been so busy fighting in the courts that what I've been reading is there's a lot of people within the Israeli government who are blaming Netanyahu for the October 7th attack, because it clearly it was really clearly an intelligence failure. How did they miss this? And that Netanyahu, who, by the way, has increasingly over the last few years surrounded himself with people who are less competent and more in his corner. Does that sound familiar? Sound familiar?
Yes. Right.
And so anyway, the long and short of this is that Netanyahu has not been overly concerned over the last few years of pursuing some kind of two-state solution, which I think everybody agrees is, or except for the extremes on both sides, agree that this is the way to go, that there's a two-state solution, that Israel is there. Israel's going to stay there, obviously, but we need some kind of Palestinian territory that is sovereign. And so as long as the players who can make something happen aren't really interested, what are you going to do?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and it goes back into such a tangled web of historical expectations and ethnic rivalries, that type of thing. I was just watching recently, as I was actually in Lebanon 2011. I was in Beirut, and then we went to Cairo after that. And I was with a guy one time, and we were in this restaurant, and they had like old 1940s, 1950s Egyptian movies up on the screen that were kind of quasi-musical movie type things. And this woman was singing on the screen. The guy pointed out the woman to me. He says, you see that woman there? And I don't remember now what her name was. He says, she was probably about the most popular entertainer in Egypt at that time, and she was Jewish. And the idea that there were Christians and Jews and Muslims, and they were living together in relative harmony, certainly up to the early part of the 20th century. And then things began to deteriorate after that, as the idea that when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and right before World War I, and then you had the idea of nationalism, and the Palestinians began to get this vision of wanting their own their own state, and then the Jews also having this idea of wanting their own state, and the Arabs. And then at the end of World War One, or actually in the process of World War One, you had all the European powers promising these various factions all these various things which they couldn't possibly deliver on because many of them directly conflicted with each other. To these various groups, and then carving up the Middle East, the Levant, after World War One in ways that made no sense, but were useful to the European powers that were there. I mean, that has just set the stage, and then there's been multiple iterations of evolution of issues since then.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it, to me, seems to go back to this idea of nationalism, wanting to have your own people, your own country, where you have control over your community and seeing yourselves. Those people prior to then had not really seen themselves as their own country, maybe having their own culture, but being part of a broader culture. So there's issues of nationalism, there's issues of religion, there's issues of colonialism, there's issues of energy, oil. There's issues. I mean, there's so many different levels of layers of conflict that are built into this whole thing. That beginning to figure out where we unravel, how you get this resolve, and it almost feels to me like. And you sort of began with this, that it seems like there have to be people on multiple sides of this who finally just decide this is unresolvable, and so therefore we have to pursue something new. That something that isn't grounded in trying to remediate issues of the past, but is around creating a vision for the future. How do you get there? I have no clue, but I think that's where it has to come from.
It's exactly right. And the other thing is, now you mentioned too that the Ottoman Empire, fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War One. So, we need to realize that the whole thing of Israel having their own place again goes back before 1948. That
right, exactly.
The UN makes it happen in 48 in their decision.
Right.
But there are these forces at work before, and by the way, you can understand this in a sense. If you you have been a population, and we all should know, if we don't, the history of anti-Semitism the past 2,000 years, and how often the church has been a perpetrator of it, unfortunately, sadly.
Right.
You can see why people like the Jews, who would want a place where they can have some sovereignty, where they can be. So we understand all that and should understand all that. And whether Palestinians viewed themselves in that way, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, I want to say now is irrelevant, because they do view themselves that way now. And to say that to you, there are sometimes, Michael, when historical arguments are important, but in the midst of the present, enough time has passed that they almost become irrelevant. That it's good to know them, but so for example, I've heard a few people, and maybe you have, as you have followed the news, but some people, and I'm going to call it the extreme left, who talks about Israel, they're colonizers and they've taken Palestinian land, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to say, stop. That ship left port well over 50 years ago. Israel is there. Whether you think the UN should have given Israel that land or not is completely irrelevant. They are there. They're not going anywhere. It's like saying to you and me, Michael, you're a colonizer. You lived on land that your ancestors took from the people who had it long before your ancestors. Well, you're not moving from your land. I'm not moving from my land. I recognize that we've done that, and in the great injustice of it, and we've got to work to do our best to make things right in present circumstances. But it's an irrelevant argument. So Israel is there, and by the way, there are people who identify themselves as Palestinians, by the way, not just Muslims, but also Christians. This is often forgotten by a lot of people.
Exactly.
That there's a lot of Christians there who identify as Palestinians. And they want a homeland. And so it seems to me that the two-state solution is the right solution. But as you just said, you've got to have the people who have the power and the influence on both sides who want to say, yeah, this hasn't been working now for how many decades? We need to come up with a solution so that there is peace, so that Israel can have their land, they can have their place, they can have their sovereign state, and the Palestinians can have theirs. But until you get serious players on both sides, and it's not Hamas is not a serious player in this.
Absolutely.
And neither is, I think, Netanyahu. I think it's going. I think it's going to take another prime minister. Now, I don't know whether he's going to be on the way out or not. I get conflicting messages how much support he has, but the point is he's there. Until that happens, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know how this is going to be resolved. And in the meantime, you get thousands of people on both sides of this conflict, men, women, and children who are innocents, who are being destroyed. And by the way, that makes things worse, because now, Michael, you've got people who have been in this for decades now. Their family members have been killed. What happens over time? Attitudes harden. Attitudes harden. Right.
Well, and I think you could even argue that the reason for such atrocities committed by Hamas against these people that were at this party in the desert, that part of the reason for being so graphic and so vicious about it, they probably know that Hamas probably knows that Hamas is not going to survive this, that they're going to get hammered pretty good for it. But what they know is that they have increased the animosity, and they have decreased the ability to ever reach a peaceful solution, which is their goal. And if martyrdom, if that's what martyrdom gets you, that's great, because in the end, it will bring about the cause that you're totally committed to. So, I think we need to understand that that Hamas is not shamed. They never will be shamed by what they did. This is a very deliberate and intentional strategy to accomplish a particular end.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so that's why if there's ever to be any solution in the future that will be lasting and that will bring lasting peace, Hamas can't be part of it. It just can't. And unless they have a, I was going to say come to Jesus moment. Maybe unless they have a come to Allah moment or something, it's just not going to happen. And the other thing you had mentioned something about, you mentioned earlier, the Jewish entertainer was the most popular in Egypt. We forget that in the Arab world and in Israel as well, there are Muslims and Christians and Jews from different cultures, different places, who live together, and they live together in harmony, and they have friendships, so often we miss that, and we want to put this as a binary conflict, but the fact of the matter is, John Poderhertz, I can never say his name. You know who I'm talking about? He's Jewish. He's a commentator. I saw him in an interview yesterday where he's Jewish. He was telling the story that he was in there in New York just the other day, and he was standing outside waiting for a cab or something, and whoever stopped recognized him, and they were Egyptian Muslims, and they asked him if he was Jewish, and he said, yeah, and which may be a little concerning at first if you're Jewish in this time. But they said we are hoping and praying for peace in the best. Right. I mean, these are Muslims saying this. So the other thing has happened, Michael, is that again, it almost seems the default human thing to fall into stereotypes and tribalism. And you want to say Hamas does not, I'm sorry, they do not represent all Muslims. They just don't.
Absolutely not.
Just like there are Christians who, we won't get into that subject, but just like there are Christians right now in the public eye who I want to say they do not represent. They do not represent all Christians.
Right.
So we forget this. The same thing, by the way, with Jews. I mean, there are Jews who have been vociferously opposed to Netanyahu's policies toward the Palestinians. So we just have to remember that there is a lot of difference and diversity in this.
Right. Well, and with so many issues, this is one of them. The easiest, the sloppiest and easiest way to deal with an issue is to identify a Satan in the midst, and then focus all your attention on that Satan that has been created, regardless of how much truth or substance there is to the Satan that's been created. And that's what these many of these people that are leading these movements, that's how they manage to get people behind the cause that they've got. What was it? I can't remember who the guy was that said, "Not every movement needs a savior, but they all need a Satan."
Yeah.
And that becomes the issue here. And it's hard because in particular situations like this, you constantly run the balance of what Hamas did was horrific in this situation. There's no excuse for it. There's no justification for it.
None.
And nothing should be given to give any quarter to that kind of behavior. But to say that, on the other hand, is to say that Israel also has issues and has done things in its not too distant past and continues to do in the present that are also unjust. And that sounds like kind of a whataboutism or a trying to equalize that the two things are the same. And it's not. It's just simply trying to point out that this is a complex mess. And I think that's more what the issue is. And this particular specific circumstance, I have no issue with saying thoroughly unjustified. There's no level of justification whatsoever in terms of what happened to Israel with this particular instance, the specific instance.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just to say what you just said is that you do have plenty of examples of Israel, tearing down Palestinian homes to build Jewish settlements.
Right.
I mean, how and you want to say to people who somehow support that, really, how would you feel if that were your home?
Right.
And in order to and there's other issues too that are involved,
right.
that can continue to foster the kinds of things that keep us where we are. And you can recognize that. You can say, I always say that human beings really are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, even though sometimes when we talk, we don't give that impression. It is very possible to say what exactly you just said. There's no incoherence here. To say what Hamas did was without excuse. And it was nefarious. It was evil. But also say at the same time, the Israeli government has not helped the cause. In the way that decisions they made, in the way that Palestinians have been treated. Right? I mean, you can actually say both of those at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's let's really get into a little fun here. Let's do some Bible stuff. All right.
Oh boy.
So you know as well as I that whenever a conflict happens over there,
yes,
a lot of Christians hop on this land was Israel's because it was promised to them by God. Israel becoming a state is a fulfillment of prophecy, and they are God's chosen people. And often Genesis 12, 1-3 gets quoted, where God says to Abraham, I will make a great nation of you. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. Seems to be the only verse they know how to quote in reference to the chosenness of Israel, but it's there.
Right. Yeah.
And so that means that whatever happens and however it happens, as Christians, we need to side with Israel and go with that, because this is their land. It belongs to them. I don't know, Michael. I've got my opinions on this, but I think maybe I should see what you think.
Well, you know far more about the history of this and the biblical aspects than I do. I would just add that in addition to this idea that we should be supporting Israel, there in some circles, there's also this idea that we should not be working to mitigate the people that want to attack. We should arm Israel. We should help them, but trying to protect. How am I say this? That Jesus coming happens when the great tribulation comes, and so therefore trying to forestall the tribulation, doing things to forestall the tribulation, only delays Jesus' return. So yeah, we need to support Israel and help them, but this idea of trying to manipulate global powers, just let it all happen. Let Jesus come, and then we can,
There's that meme. There's that meme on social media. You've probably seen it. It says anybody who believes in the rapture shouldn't be put in charge of anything. And, which actually I support that. You believe in a rapture? Okay, you can't run the show. All right. Yes, and that we use what we happen to think is a fulfillment of prophecy as a way of being inactive. So okay, so let me give some thoughts here on this.
Yeah.
Now this has nothing to do with the question of whether Israel today should be in that land and whether what the United Nations did was right or not. Okay.
Right.
They're there. Okay. And I would argue that after the Holocaust, something needed to be done to give Jews a place. Okay. Now, whether that should have been Israel or, as somebody said, I heard somebody say the other day, Alaska, it's irrelevant. Okay. They're there. Okay. They're there. But is it a fulfillment of prophecy? My short answer is no, it's not. Because all the texts that are used are basically proof texted. I mean, what these folks do, and proof texting is where you cherry pick verses and put them together to make your point, right? And so what they have done is they cherry picked all kinds of different verses out of Scripture, and then they've knitted them together like a patchwork quilt and say, here it is. But when you really look at those passages in their context, it's just ultimately hard to say that the UN decision in 48 was a fulfillment of prophecy. It might have been a good decision, okay? Right. But it's not a fulfillment of prophecy. So now, Israel being given that land, well, when you read the Old Testament, obviously, you get in Genesis, the first books of the Bible, God promises Abraham Canaan, promises descendants this land. That in and of itself is complicated, but nevertheless, that's there. And that is the promised land. That does not preclude, therefore, that 2,000 years later, after the time of Jesus, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135, that Israel is finally has that land, in a sense, taken away for good. Okay. That doesn't mean that they were entitled by God's promise to that land today. Here's this gets complicated. So let me sort of why them. The difference is that the ancient state of Israel in the Old Testament is a theocracy. It is ruled by God. It is unique among the ancient nations because you have the three offices that are really critical in Old Testament Israel: prophet, priest, and king. What's really unique for Israel is that the king is not the sole and main authority. It's the prophet. It's the prophet. So you get the story of Nathan coming to David after David's rape of Bathsheba and conspiring to get her husband killed on the front lines because Bathsheba was pregnant with his kid. When Nathan tells that story about the lamb and you are the man story, he comes in, and what does David do? He realizes he's been wronged. In other words, the prophet really becomes the central figure because the prophet holds the king accountable. I can tell you that in any other ancient nation, if this had been any other ancient nation, Nathan would have been dead where he stood. Okay. And then you have the priest who orders the religious life, orders the temple, cultists, as you call it, the worship. The modern state of Israel is not like that. It's not a theocracy. There's no priest. There's a prime minister. It's a parliamentary government. It's democracy. And so it just operates fundamentally differently. And then here for me is the most important point related to that. When Jesus comes, God gets out of the theocracy business
Right.
He no longer is doing that. That he did that with Israel, didn't go well. God used it, but God finally in Jesus now realize, and just think about what the Gospels are saying, what Paul is saying. I mean, in Jesus now, Jesus becomes the temple. So there's really no need for a temple.
Right.
There's no need, there's just no need for any of this, because now the people of God are no longer identified by land. They're no longer identified by any of these things. So for Christians, the question of whether Israel today, modern Israel, should exist is more of what I would call a human rights humanitarian question. It's not an issue with the Bible.
Right.
So when people say, well, Israel's entitled to that land today, well, I don't know. Are they any more entitled to it than you and I are entitled to the land we're living on?
Right.
As knowing there were people who lived here long before us, long before our ancestors came. So to me, that's just kind of it's kind of a moot question. Right. I want to say Israel is there and they're going to stay there. And how can we work through some things that we can just stop the suffering and the killing and the death?
Right. And to add a little bit to what you were saying there, you're going back to talking about Israel, the priest, the prophet, king. That my understanding is that with the New Testament, Jesus basically takes on those three roles. He becomes the priest, the prophet, and the king of his kingdom. Right. And that it is by us being connected as organic parts of his body that his priesthood, his being the prophet, priest, prophet, and king, being all three of those things, is evidenced through his body, the church. That is where how that dynamic works. And I think it's Christopher Wright who had this wonderful diagram, which is always stuck in my head, that he has two triangles, and he has a smaller triangle that says, and it's inside a larger triangle. The smaller triangle has God at the top, it has Israel at the bottom, and it has Jews at the other corner of the triangle. And then the larger triangle has God, all creation, and humanity. And he says God's vision is that he starts with that triangle and then begins to expand that triangle within the larger triangle until it subsumes it all. Yeah. And that is basically what Paul is saying is the New Testament mission. What Jesus was saying in Paul's interpretation of it is that triangle simply expands. And so it's not just that not only is Israel not the idea of a nation of Israel is not the fulfillment of some prophecy. The United States of America is not some fulfillment of God's prophecy of bringing, truth and justice to the world. No nation.
Michael, now you're meddling.
No nation is the representation of the kingdom of God in the world.
That's right.
And I think that to me is the larger interpretation. So what happens with individual nations is largely, in a very meaningful sense, irrelevant to what God's mission is in the world, because God's mission eventually is that all of creation, all of humanity becomes part of this organic, loving, shalom-filled union of humanity with God at the head. So
the tribe of the church is not tribal.
Right.
And of course, this is a message, forget Israel for a moment. You mentioned the United States. This is a message we still continue to we still have what I'm going to call an Old Testament view of the way kingdoms work. And it isn't that way. America is, I'm sorry, folks, America is not chosen by God, called by God. No nation, earthly nation. Right. That all is that's outmoded thinking as far as the Bible's concerned. It is the church. Right. And now I do want to mention real quick about the issue of Israel's chosenness, because you do have to say, look, Stanley Hauerwas has said this. I heard him say it all the time in class years ago. If Israel is not chosen by God, then Jesus cannot be the Messiah. And if Jesus isn't the Messiah, we're in a heap of trouble. Okay. Right. He didn't say heap of trouble. He had another way of saying it. But
I've heard Hauerwas. I can imagine what language
yeah. Kind of interesting. So anyway, that's true. And when you read Romans, and I'm going to go to Paul here now, in Romans 9-11, which is the key passage here, he still has a concept of Israel's chosenness. He does not reject that.
Right.
He does not reject that. And Israel is chosen. And Paul's the horns of the dilemma that Paul is dealing with here is, if Israel is chosen and God keeps God's promises, and God does,
right,
he has made certain promises to God's people, to the Jews.
Right.
How's he going to fulfill those promises if Israel, by and large, has not believed in Jesus? This is the conundrum he's working through in those chapters.
Right.
Now, he does certainly. I mean, he's got this vision. The only way this is going to work is that if Israel has some kind of turning in the future. So he does envision this turning in the future.
Right.
And so when we have this conversation, and I say that, and you agree with me that Israel's occupation of that land now is not a fulfillment of prophecy. We're not saying that God has rejected Israel as his chosen. They are chosen.
Right.
God has chosen. But for Paul, this is a missional salvific issue.
Right.
And so that God is going to fulfill these promises that God made to Israel through Jesus.
Right.
But there's no conversation about the land. There's no conversation about that piece of real estate.
Right.
That is just no longer in view for Paul.
Right. Yeah, the people of Israel have been given a promise, and that promise still stands until the consummation of all things.
Yeah.
That will be there. The idea of a nation state is a relatively new idea in the history of humanity. And the idea that the founding of a particular nation state somehow is some fulfillment of this idea of God's chosen people and the promise that God made 2,000 years ago. It's anachronistic. Yeah. And so, yes, the promise has been made to the Jews, but not necessarily to this particular activity. Or when I say that, I'm not saying there shouldn't be a nation state either. I'm not saying that either.
Right.
I'm just saying the issue of nation state or not is not relevant to whether God is going to fulfill God's promises.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's interesting talking to Jews over the years, as I have, and of course you can get the extreme Hasidic Jews who probably would like a temple and all of that. But when you talk to the average Jew, the observant Jew, I'm Jews who practice. They're like, you talk about, because Christians talk about, the temple's going to be rebuilt and all of this kind of thing. Again, which is not something you can get out of the scripture without pulling them scriptures out and knitting them together into a random pattern. Right. But you talk to them and they say, we don't need a temple. We haven't had one for 2,000 years. And why would we go back to sacrificing animals? Yeah. Right? Why would we do that? We haven't had that. We've had, Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism is really what we know today, has survived for 2,000 years. They survived without temple, and they survived without land. Now, again, that's not an argument against Israel being where they are. It's just to simply say Judaism continued. Judaism had a vibrancy that continued beyond these things that disappeared. That's not to say that when the temple was destroyed in 70, that it wasn't a climactic problem and things like that. It's just to say that Judaism was a resilient faith, that because of the scrolls, because of the law, because of the scriptures, I would say, which is, by the way, the one thing Christians and Jews have in common more than anything is we're people of the book. And they were able to have a vitality. The only problem was for 2,000 years is that they found themselves in places where they were not liked. And Michael, we cannot fail to mention, in the midst of these last 3 weeks, what again is being revealed as what I'm going to call, and maybe it's a little over dramatic, but I don't think so, what is a global anti-Semitism that exists in the world. I mean, it is almost guaranteed that when this thing happened, that the anti-Semites come out of the wall. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been anti-Muslim things either. I'm not saying that. But it almost seems like there is this incredible hatred globally of Jews. It hasn't disappeared.
and even across political spectrums.
Yes.
Left and right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, the left, the people on the left like to go after, you know, the right-wing anti-Semitism, you know, the neo-Nazis
Right.
and all of that. But boy, I'll tell you what, there is a anti-Semitism on the left that rears its head when these things happen.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And I'm
Right.
not talking about, I am not talking about being critical of the Israeli government and some of the things that they do. That's not anti-Semitic. Right. That's not anti-Semitic in the least. But something darker gets revealed in the comments that you hear. Right. And it's very, I mean, I find it to be very disconcerting.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, and I think part of this, we kind of went into a deep dive into the history and the biblical stuff of it, which may not seem to have much directly related to the current topic that we're talking about. But I think it does in one sense, in that I think in the background, in the ether behind a lot of people's reflection on these issues is this sort of assumption that Israel has a right to be a nation because God foreordained that he was going to create a nation of Israel. And excuse me. And so somehow not supporting Israel is to in whatever it is that they do, not to be critical of them and not support them almost unquestioningly is somehow an affront to God. There's that sort of sense of things sometimes I feel in the background of some of these conversations that is deeply unhelpful in terms of getting to a future solution. Because somehow, as we began this, somehow we have to find some way to get beyond the legitimate complaints, the legitimate grievances over injustices that have been perpetrated in multiple directions by various players, and finally come up and say, somehow we have to come to a new solution, that we have to come to a new place of being. Yeah.
And here's another thing. Often the support for Israel being God's chosen and God promised them a nation becomes a justification for allowing Israel to do whatever it wants. Right. What I want to say is, if you're going to be consistent with the Old Testament tradition, so if you're going to say that land is Israel's, God gave it to them, they should have it today, then you need to apply the entire story of the Old Testament, because the prophets are brutal in their criticism of Israel's injustice, more so than other nations. I mean, some of the prophets do criticize other nations, but when it comes to Israel, they are accountable. The Israelis they're God's people, so they are accountable. And the prophets just level, I mean, read Amos. The prophets level withering critiques against Israel. So if you are going to go that route, then you better be ready to be able to also be critical when God's people promote injustice or act unjustly. This is just really important to say. So again, it's that kind of cherry picking. So, oh, by the way, let me say one other thing. God promises Abraham a nation, right?
Right.
God promises Ishmael a nation too.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
God promises Esau a nation. I always say that when you read the Old Testament, it's like God is Oprah. You get a nation, everybody a nation, everybody gets a nation, right?
Right, yeah.
We forget that, yes, there's no doubt that Isaac, the chosen line, that's where God is going to work through primarily in his plan of salvation. But Ishmael, the sons of Ishmael, who now today are Muslims who trace their ancestry back to Ishmael, God says to them, I'm going to give you a nation.
Right.
God says to Edom, I'm going to give you a nation. What is that? What should we draw from that? Well, probably more than one thing, but I'm going to draw one thing from it. And that is, here we have the glimpse of God's universal plan, that God wants to bless everybody.
Right.
And so Ishmael too gets a nation. Edom gets a nation. Esau gets a nation. Who are not, by the way, Esau doesn't figure, I mean, he doesn't figure into the line, right? Because it's Jacob that's, you know. So just want to remember again that for God, the big picture of this is about reconciliation. and bringing people
Right.
together. It's not about
Right.
division. It's not about
Right.
pitting peoples against peoples. And yet Christians,
Right.
we often do that. I mean, because let's be honest, these are sloppy readings of the biblical text.
Yes,
They're
absolutely.
sloppy.
Yeah.
They're just sloppy readings.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I just think about from a sociological standpoint, that we aren't simply individual human beings and then somehow just individually members of 9 billion people on the planet. There are intermediary associations and levels of existence in between those two, from family to neighborhood to city to larger regions to nations, that kind of thing. And the idea is that we need those, because that's who we are as human beings. We need more localized contact community in order to flourish. And I think the issue is that everybody on the planet has a right to be a part of healthy, shalom-filled communities at the various intermediate levels. And so the question is, how do we foster that instead of pitting this group has the right to exist while that one doesn't, and and trying to figure out how it is that we achieve that. That to me seems to be, if we're talking about the idea of the triangles I was talking about before, that is what a shalom-filled world looks like, is everybody living in communities at various degrees of abstraction that are healthy and promote flourishing. Yeah.
So really then what we should want, is a situation over there in the Middle East where Israelis can live in peace and govern themselves, and where Palestinians can live in peace and govern themselves.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, that's what and so then they flourish. I mean, again,
Right.
This thing about, the church and reconciliation, we want, as Christians, we should want everybody to flourish.
Right.
And to create the conditions for that. But, the problem right now is I don't think the major players really are interested in the flourishing of everybody over there. Right.
Right.
And you're right to say, tribes matter.
Right.
Tribes matter. Right. You and I are
Right.
Americans, and I'm Italian, and so my great grandparents, I knew them. They came over from Italy and Sicily, and you have your ancestry. You appeal to it at times about
I've got my great grandfather was Danish, but
Danish,
most of it goes back well into American history. Most of it.
So was your great grandfather a Great Dane? I'm sorry, I just had to ask
He was.
that. He was a Great Dane.
Absolutely.
That's what I had a professor.
A little Viking up here.
Oh, is that right? I had a professor who referred to Soren Kierkegaard as a Great Dane one time. I thought that was pretty good. But those things are not unimportant. Okay.
Right.
The problem is when the tribe becomes more determinative.
Right.
When those, I'm going to call them sub-tribes,
yes,
become more determinative than what it means to belong to the tribe called church.
Right.
And that as a follower of Jesus, that determines my loyalty and my priorities more so than what it means to be an American or to be Italian or to live in Ohio, to be a Buckeye, go Bucks.
Right.
I mean, there's those tribes matter. We shouldn't say, I get troubled when I see people will post memes that say, there's, your religion should be human. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, it's a nice sentimental sentiment. I mean, we're all human and we're created in God's image. But we can't reject the fact that we all have these other identities that figure into who we are, and they're okay and they matter. But at the end of the day, the problem I see with Christians is that we are allowing our tribalisms, whatever those sub-tribes are, to be more determinative of life and meaning and what's right and what's wrong than what it means to be church. That's my complaint. Right.
And I don't remember who the person was in the past who had the comment, says that God created man in God's image and man decided to return the favor.
Yeah, that was either Mark Twain or Nietzsche. I can't remember.
Well, somebody back 100 years ago or more, but I don't remember. But that phrase has always stuck with me. And I think that is one of the true challenges of the church, because at local community, at the more localized level, we are just by availability of who's available to us, we are going to tend to be like we tend to be with other people who we are alike.
Right.
And so we're going to tend to have very similar values. And the great tendency is then to create a God and a religion that then reinforces and supports the values and the ways we think about things, rather than having a God who is the prophet, who is challenging us to see things in new ways and different ways, and to live differently. And that's why I think while it's important to recognize the need for those smaller human communities, then it is also necessary for those smaller human communities to be linked in some organic ways to communities who are outside of their own community,
Right.
In terms of interaction and exchange, because it is in the interaction with those other communities that we often find ourselves challenged to think differently and to be able to adapt. And I really think, not to go too far afield from where our conversation is, but I think it relates. I think I mentioned before about the author Anthony Giddens and his book Runaway World. And one of the things that he talks about is that the world is becoming more homogeneous economically. It's becoming more integrated, and economies tend to work the same ways everywhere around the world. And those that join that economy tend to flourish. You tend to have increases in well-being, life expectancy, things improve as you become a part of that. But on the other hand, culturally, it is blowing things apart, is becoming less homogeneous. And that is because so many people that have voices that were not heard in the past, because of internet, because of digital communication, so on, there are ways now of making your story heard and finding others who have those same stories to make those links. And so you have this new way of constantly being exposed to people with different views, different values, in ways that we were never, even if we wanted to, we were not able to have access to that kind of exposure. For some people, they see that as very liberating. They see that as exciting. It's mind opening. They see new possibilities. They learn from it. For others, it is profoundly threatening. It is challenging what they have always held was the solid truth, and these new perspectives are a threat to them. And I think that that's what you see with a lot of these reactionary movements that exist around the world. And then that whole fear, that sense of tribalism and things fracturing apart, I think is what increases the tribalism out of fear, that then feeds into backing various tribes and what develops in places like Israel is this tribalism, as opposed to what we were talking about a moment ago, the one triangle expanding to become the bigger, with Christ as priest, prophet, and king of the world, and all the world living in shalom. That's
one of the things, Michael, that so enlarged my world is my international travel.
Right.
And I don't mean going to Europe. Europe's great. I love England, or Canada. Canadians are great. But I mean going to the Caribbean, going to Africa, and meeting wonderful people made in God's image, who think differently from the way I think, who approach things differently, offer wisdom. And their culture is just like our culture. It's got its problems. You know, we've got ideas we shouldn't have. But I found it, you say some people find that threatening, some people find that, I mean, I found it exhilarating to be able to be in places where, to realize that humanity is a big thing. And I relish being in those cultures now. I relish, I'm become like a sponge. I want to learn everything that I can. And but there are people who and I don't want to say that if you don't travel internationally, you're going to be narrow-minded. I don't want to say that, because I know people who aren't that way. But it's amazing, some of the people I've known who have this fearful perspective, who you talk about, they're afraid. They see these other things as a threat. A lot of them have gone nowhere. And they live in communities where, you know, the next door neighbor isn't from Muslim, or the next door neighbor isn't from Guatemala. And they just have this homogeneous existence. And so there's so much that they see as a threat. To me, it's sad. It's sad.
and the strong men and the nefarious power brokers that exist in the world, they know how to exploit that.
Yes, they do.
That's the fear that they feed on. That's what they try to stoke, and that's how they end up perpetuating their power and their injustices by keeping that fear alive. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you just say? Somebody said that we don't always need a savior, but we need a Satan.
Right.
Yeah,
yes.
that's good. I like
exactly.
that we
Yeah.
they're always, and by the way, you see this in politics. Something will happen, there'll be a scandal in an administration, or there'll be something goes wrong. And immediately the pundits are saying, okay, whose head's going to roll for this? That we got to find somebody. The way to do this is to pin it on somebody, kick them out, and then we can keep on going, even though it probably was a concerted effort. And so we've got to have somebody to blame. And that just seems to be endemic. It started in the garden, didn't it? Right. Who
Well, and I think that's one of the other issues, and it possibly feeds into the topic we're talking about today, is that we have, as humans, we have a intense desire for simplification, to shrink things down to a specific cause, and then if we can just attack that cause and get rid of that, then we'll have solved the problem. And that makes it nice and simple and easy to deal with. When in fact, many of the issues that we confront are so vastly more complex than that. That the resolution, there is no one person to pin things on in terms of trying to get to a solution. And I think that that's the issue that you kind of end up with. This is probably in the extreme. I think that that's what you've got here with the issues that we're talking about with Israel, Palestine, so on and so forth. There is no person that we can say, well, boy, if we just took care of that person, we could fix the problem. And yet that's what many of the people that are activists and so on are try to promote. Because that's the easy way to get support.
We have this inherent need, it seems, for order, for clarity. The way I think about it is I think about my study that I'm in here in my basement, that I get more work done and I feel more productive when it's ordered and cleaned up, as opposed to when it's messy and everything everywhere. Some people work in mess all right, but when I say, okay, it's time, I'm done with the mess, and I start to organize everything, I feel like now I'm in a space where I can get something accomplished. The problem is that the world isn't a neat study, right? The world is a messy. And it usually is a mess. But the problem is when we try to order it and clean it up, we do so with simplistic solutions. They just don't work. But it makes me feel better. If I can order my world, if I can give you one explanation for the Israeli Palestinian conflict, if I can give you one explanation for immigration at the southern border, if I can give you one explanation for how COVID spreads. And I mean, then it becomes easy in my world. As long as my world stays ordered and it's comfortable for me, I'm good with that. But you start interjecting that mess in, like you just talked about, now I'm really uncomfortable to live in that kind of ambiguity. We don't like ambiguity.
We'd like the false sense of control as opposed to the reality of complexity. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. And then what's that old thing I saw in somebody's office one time? Don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff. Not really. Not really.
Yeah,
it really isn't. So, all right. Well, I think we need to end there for today. That was a good discussion. I appreciate you, Michael, and the insights you offer. And friends, thank you for joining us. By the way, before you click out, if with videocast or podcast, hit the subscribe button or the like button, leave a comment. We're glad to. That helps us out if you do that. I don't know how it helps us out, but that's what they tell us. So it helps us out. So anyway, I am Allan Bevere. And this is Faith Seeking Understanding. And the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe. I believe in order to understand. So keep seeking, my friends.
Bye.